And let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar on SharePoint 2016. I'm going to hand things over to our Microsoft Product Manager, David Mulkey.
Good morning. It's fantastic to be here with you all and to have this in-depth discussion about SharePoint 2016. We're hosting several webinars over the month of March covering some of the most popular topics from Microsoft. So please check out our website to see our past webinars or to register for any of our future webinars. So as we all know, SharePoint is one of the most collaborative pieces of software that Microsoft has ever put out. At the same time, it's one of the most complicated. Joining us today is Randall Hall to help navigate building search functionality for SharePoint. Randall was recently named one of the top 2 instructors worldwide for New Horizons. He is also a SharePoint MVP and one of the most respected names in the SharePoint community. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Randall Hall. Randall?
All right, thank you, David. First of all, I want to say again, morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon your time zone, and thanks for joining us today. Our discussion specifically is going to be over search related to SharePoint. Now, as David alluded to earlier, SharePoint's a vast topic, so we're going to focus specifically here on search. So to get things started, we're going to take a look at the search component called the search service application that actually adds search functionality to SharePoint. We'll talk about how to configure that search and then manage it. Now, number one thing to remember with search, out of the box, it does not work. You must configure it. In fact, the search itself, the configuration is all the responsibility of your search administrator. Now, many organizations are a little strapped. They may have just a farm administrator. This becomes an additional role that farm admin will need to take on. So to get things started with search, we first need to understand the architecture of search and how search actually functions behind the scenes. The best analogy I've found is an old-fashioned telephone book. Now, if you don't know what a telephone book is out there, you may need to ask your parents. But as far as the telephone book goes, why this is such a good analogy is back when it originally was created, we had a phone number, 3 digits originally, then 4, then 7, as determined by Bell Laboratories that us silly humans could remember. And those phone numbers were the focus. That's what was important. I need to find that phone number. That original phone number was in a white page section. That white pages was just nothing more than a listing of the phone number and the data about data that wanted you to select or use that phone number. That metadata, we call it, is important specifically in SharePoint search, so we can do a better refinement of those search results later on. Now, one of the reasons that this telephone book does work as a good analogy is there's 2 steps to the process. We must build the telephone book, and then we're going to look information up inside that phone book. The process of building the phone book, what you might know as crawling, indexing, we call content in SharePoint search. The other side of this is looking up information, which is called query. Now, the search history for SharePoint is vast. Microsoft tried several things over the past, and for $1.2 billion, they bought a company called Fast and Transfer out of Oslo, Norway. That acquisition was further brought into SharePoint starting back in 2010, and then is fully integrated into SharePoint now in 2013 and 16. And so this reflects that fast search engine that Microsoft acquired now many years ago. Now, the fast search environment, as it was called back then, was used by lots of companies and even by the government. Library of Congress at one point was using fast search, as well as the US Army. So this integration was an enterprise solution, and definitely if you haven't seen search in a while, it's definitely grown up. However, some of the concepts stay the same The naming or convention is similar, but there has been some wholesale changes on the back end. So again, as we look at search, we break it up into two components, the content side and the query side. So the content side, we have to build and create this index, what we refer to as our phone book, so we can look up those phone numbers. Now, what's important about that phone number is that we need that number. We need other entries, though, that give us data about data, metadata, why we would click or use that number. And so the process is twofold. We have to go out and get the information from a content source. This is where the information will come from, and it can come from anywhere. In fact, you can write whatever content source connector that you want. There's even third-party vendors that'll do so. Microsoft has, though, included, a connector for SharePoint for websites and file shares, public folders in Exchange, Documentum, and Lotus Notes, and other connectors have been out there historically. Some of them, though, have gone out of favor. So we're going to focus mainly on the content source being SharePoint for this discussion. However, as long as it's a network resource, you can connect to literally anything in that index. As long as it has a web link or a network connection, we're good to go. Now, the gathering of information is a two-step process. First of all, we gather information from where the content lives, and the term was used, crawler. Why crawler? World Wide Web, think of a spider that's crawling around and gathering that information, bringing it back to the SharePoint index. Think of the index as our nest where we're bringing things back. Technically, it's going out, getting information from these locations on the web through that spider process. These artifacts are brought back to that index and are ingested. This topic might be best for Halloween or in October. As you see, we have some fairly gruesome ideas of concepts of information being gathered, extracted, and ingested into the index. But why the index is so important is the index is where information is stored. Not on the database where normal SharePoint content is stored, but on the hard drive. That index is very important. Once the index is built, and it can grow quite large, it is propagated to the query server where we actually look up information. Now, during that information gathering phase, that information comes from locations that we call crawled properties. So those items that are being crawled. And then those crawled properties have to be mapped over to what we use or consume are called managed properties. Now in SharePoint, if you're familiar with columns, those site columns will automatically be mapped over for you. Any local columns, you'll have to do a little work and add them in. Technically, this is referred to as our search schema. All right, so we built the index, we built the telephone book. Now we propagate that out to our query server, typically our web front end. You're gonna notice I have two roles here, two layers of SharePoint servers. This is on purpose as we need to balance the load that this will take. So as mentioned previous, we break up search architecture into two parts. The content side, which we refer to here on the left-hand side of this diagram, and then over on the right-hand side, we have the query. Now, I should mention this diagram does come from Search Topologies Explained, so you can check out their website down below. And you're gonna notice that we have our content sources over on the left-hand side. As I mentioned before, wide variety of sources are allowed. And then over on the right, we actually have our user interface. So left, all of our content, it's being gathered in, it's being ingested, and it's being part of our index. Now to do this or perform this task, we have 4 databases that we use. So SharePoint historically, of course, stores content in SQL Server. The same goes for search. Then over on the right-hand side, you'll see the query process. The web front end will request the information through what we call a query. That query looks up the information out of the index. Now, other aspects of SharePoint search you may not be aware of is those results are refined based on criteria you select, but also people using search. As more and more people use search, the results get better over time. So this product does get better over age. As you click on links, we learn the relevancy of that. We have a database called the analytics database. We analyze statistics, so analytics, just a fancy term for that. And we report back, and those items will be increased in those search results. The crawl process is intense. It's going to typically overwhelm several servers, so we can throttle back that process if we need. We call these impact rules, that we can reduce that impact. We can be a better neighbor. As those links are learned, they're stored in their own database, and then as needed, then we build and create our index from our link database. We should also mention we have a separate search admin database that stores our administrative settings. Now, when we look at the search architecture, there are 6 components that need to run: crawl, content processing, analytics processing, indexing, query processing, and search administration. Each one of these components, you can pick and choose which server you want to have that role. If you need 2 servers, you can turn that on for failover, high availability. If one fails, the other can take over. And so if you start doing the math in your head, yes, we can have several servers that we might need to use. And we'll talk to that here in a moment. We mentioned the crawl connectors. These are the ones that we have, again, out of the box. You do have the ability to build, create whichever crawl connector you want, or you can tie in through third-party vendors additional components. And as pointed out earlier, we do have 4 databases that we use. The content processing component, where we go in and extract the data, as mentioned earlier, some gruesome terms used here, the ingestion of artifacts into our index. That is, we take those crawled properties, we map those over to our managed properties, and we use those managed properties within our index. We do have the ability to include or exclude different file types here. We can do custom entity extraction, which is a list of keywords that are found during the search process and identified as a certain value, such as a company name. These custom dictionaries are set up through Managed Meta Web Services, which is an additional service application that's a requirement of search. Now, when we talk about the analysis of our statistics or the analytics component, what we're really doing is we're analyzing who's using these items. Now, what's an item? An item in SharePoint search is anything that was crawled. It can be a web page, a document, an item in a list. All of these can be indexed. Now, another thing to realize is we're analyzing how many items were crawled, what your user interaction is, what your page count is, how many times are we viewing that page. And from that, we can actually increase the relevancy of those items. So as mentioned before, the more you use search, the better those search results will be. Now, on the index component, one of the things to realize is that search is building this index on the back end. It's critical. If we don't have an index, there is no search. Now, one of my mentors early on used to say, if it ain't in the index, it ain't in search. And so my mentor here, Daniel Webster, one of my first instructors, he and Leo Salza again, help me understand search. And for me, I started back with fast search many years ago. Now, the reason for that was a background in Unix and Linux systems, and search is configured mainly via command line. So I learned how to work with servers, Unix and Linux systems back many years ago. Originally, this was written in Python and then handled via command line interface through fast search. Well, now as we fast forward to SharePoint today, of course, it uses PowerShell. Now, through this process, we can actually build and create multiple servers handling these roles. That index component that needs to run, we may run that on multiple servers. So if one fails, the other one can take over. So we can, again, make sure that this index is always fresh. We can also break up this index into smaller chunks. We call it partitioning to make it even faster. Ideally, about 20 million items should be in an index partition. After that, you should break it up into an additional chunk. Index replication or replica is we can have a copy of the index. So if one server fails, the other one can take over. Now, once the index is built, we read information out of the index via the query process. Query processing takes your queries from the web front end and it processes that query. Now, as we mentioned before, the company that Microsoft purchased, Fast and Transfer, was from Oslo, Norway. This is a European community, obviously, and lots of languages. So this company was aware of multiple languages, and search must be aware of multiple languages as well. It takes actually the original query, it breaks up that word into smaller chunks. We call it word breaking, technically called stemming and lemmatization. The breaking of the word, though, is key, so we can find the root of the word and do keyword searches from there. Currently, we do word breaking on nouns in SharePoint Search. Also, at this point, the results are sent back to the client and all information being security trimmed. What is interesting about fast search, it actually security trims before and after. And then at that point, the information is displayed on the screen through a result type. This becomes important later on where we can identify the source of those results, create result source and result types for better display of data. So when we look at the search world, it is vast. There's lots of things to think about and start to build. We start looking at our search topology, being able to support all the items that you might have out for search. Now, another term we use here is data corpus, where it's coming from, another gruesome term for Halloween. And so in that data corpus, we consume all those items. Now, we don't care about the size in terabytes. We care about the number of items. Think those items in that original telephone book. We do have rules that we can set up to control the crawl process to get better index, build a better index. Again, if it ain't in the index, it ain't in search. We have rules to help improve the query process, and both of these are items that we explore in the classroom or Microsoft has documented well. The hard part, though, becomes mapping these managed properties over from crawled properties. Technically, we call it our search schema. This is where most of the work has to be done. So when you have a column that's labeled color, how is it going to be used or refined later on? But you may do things such as product ID num. What are we going to use that for as far as our search results? That's where the mappings are so very important. Now, the mappings can be done at the site collection level. It can also be done at the farm level. Now, refreshing, crawling the data, very important. And we call this a crawl schedule. We can set up that crawl schedule to make sure information is being refreshed as it needs. Now, one of the questions I'll get from several students is, well, what's this node runner? Why is it consuming all these resources? That is search. What is MS search? That makes more sense. But node runner is one of those services also running behind the scenes that'll be consuming massive amounts of processing power and CPU because of how intense search will be. Now, search is not something that you can just turn on and walk away. It is something that we're always constantly maintaining. So when we look at search itself, we next look at the search topology. And the concept will be, do we want a dedicated search farm, or do we want to build search within the SharePoint experience? And it really does depend upon the size of your environment. Now, as mentioned before, we don't care about the volume, how many terabytes you have. It's the number of items. Now, these items will be listed later in what we call a crawl log, and we'll be able to view that and see exactly what an item is. There's many items that you may not want, such as items that show up in a task list or items that show up maybe in a workflow history. You want to remove those. So adding information to the index or trimming the index is key. And again, some organizations will have dozens of people that handle that. That big search company you may be aware of, that begins with a G, they have thousands of people that manage, massage that index. It's all about the index. And again, if it's not in the index, it's not in search. So as this index grows, we need to make sure that we have the sufficient number of servers to be able to handle that load. So as Microsoft spells out, this actually comes from their SharePoint posters, is that in a search topology, you start scaling this based on the number of items in your index. If you are looking at a dedicated search farm, or you can have this part of your existing SharePoint farm if we're below about 20 million items. Now, that is 20 million items that you're crawling. That includes all SharePoint sites, websites, file shares, all of those line items that you're bringing in. Now, in a SharePoint world, we have the ability to add a server to the farm and configure its role. So if you're using 2016, we have min role, so you can assign the search role to that server, or you may need to manually go in and do that. However, your job's not done at that point. You'll still need to configure this via PowerShell to add those servers to their roles. Now, as we mentioned before, we had 6 specific roles. We have query processing, index, crawl, admin, analytics, and content processing. We can assign those roles to servers as needed. Recommendations are to have the query processing role on your web front end. This also, again, will store our index, and then we also have those back-end processes that need to run, and we can run those on a separate server, such as an application or mid-level server. Now, if the query processing component fails, query is no longer working. Your users do not get back search results. So it's important to keep that up and running all the time, make it high available in large environments where search is very, very important. The crawler, on the other hand, most companies want to make sure it is redundant, so that's continuously processing. But if that was to fail, the only thing that happens is the index gets failed or slowly starts to age out. So that stale index or older index could cause users not to get the search results that they want, but at least they're getting in results. So older archive information still showing up. But ideally, for larger environments where search is critical, you want 2 servers handling the query processing and index component, 2 servers handling crawl, admin, analytics, and our content processing component. And then, of course, all of those databases on the back end. Now, as your organization grows up to 80 million items, we need to have now 1, 2, 3, 4 servers. We're going to break up that partition into 4 chunks. And then we need copies of each, or a replica. So that means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 servers handling the query processing role, and then a whole host of servers now building the index behind the scenes. As you grow, SharePoint search can grow. 200 million items. Here's an example here. We have 10 partitions. And in this case, we then, of course, have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 servers, and then from that, they'll be able to handle that query load. Then on the back end, of course, we're building more and more servers to handle that crawl. Now, this idea, as we start building out our solutions, as we grow larger and larger, we require, of course, more and more servers to be able to handle that load, and can scale out even to very, very large search farms. So here's an example of up to 500 million items that you might have out in your data corpus. Now, anything beyond that, we most likely will start looking at breaking it up into multiple indexes. Now, search does not come at you without cost. So number one, Microsoft has their recommendations, JJ219628 out on TechNet, for what we need on the server side. We need 48 gig of memory on each server in the farm. That's the index component, a query processing component, and working as that web front end. We need 24 gig of memory on each server. That's the analytics processing component, crawl component, content processing component, or the search admin component. We are looking at a hard drive location separate from SharePoint and separate from your log files, where the index will be stored, and this can grow really, really big. 500 gig should get you a good start, but monitor it closely. Then we're looking at 8 cores for minimum, but 8 cores recommended on the processing side. So when you start looking at search in a small environment, we're really looking at having a web tier with 2 servers, an application tier with 2 or 3 servers, and then we have our database tier. And so for a lot of organizations, up to that 20 million that we mentioned before, items in the data corpus, this can work quite well. Now, most likely you will need additional servers at the application tier level to handle other services such as management web services and all of those. So the overall goal of our environment in a search environment is to have the ability to mix and match as you need. So here's an example of how we manage search through central admin, and this is a typical search application topology. So we have the admin role running on 2 machines. If one fails, the other one can take over. We have our crawler running, our content processing, analytics processing running. We have query processing running across multiple machines, and then we have our indexes stored. So if one fails, the other one can take over. Now, as we scale out search, however, other factors may need to be realized. Number one, there are other databases we mentioned before. So such as the small environment, you may not have dedicated search servers. These may be servers that aren't in your farm. Medium-sized organizations, we may need to start thinking, though, scaling things out. Additional crawl databases, link databases, or analytics databases. They do recommend another crawl database for every 20 million items, another link database for 60 million items, and another analytics database for 500,000 items. For administrative purposes, redundancy there. Query processing, redundancy there. And then multiple servers as we get larger to maintain that index. So things you need to think about is, what do I need to crawl? What platforms do you need to crawl? And how often do you need to crawl those content sources? How much information are you going to crawl, and how important is that information? Now, remember, if it's information that's old, it's archived, we don't need it in the index, don't include it. You want to massage the index. Now, we typically in search have two types of indexes. We have one that is going to look and find everything anywhere at any time. Think of it as a needle in a haystack. Or you might have a very highly refined relevant index. So as an organization, it's one decision you need to make. You do not have to include everything in the index. In fact, the smaller the index is, the more refined it is, the better search results will be. The one exception is if you are setting up search for e-discovery, you will need to do a pinpoint search. That is, you need to include everything so you can find those items later on. Now, the other items to think about is when you build your content source, what type of crawl is going to run? What depth are you going to crawl? How regular will you crawl the information? And if we do have a conflict, who wins that through a priority? We do have an additional crawl now on SharePoint sites called a continuous crawl. So the first crawl we do is a full crawl. It gathers everything. Then incremental crawl is anything that has changed. Some full crawls can take days to run. Incremental crawls, several hours. A continuous crawl is a way to continuously update those very active SharePoint collaboration sites. Continuous crawl, again, is though reserved only for SharePoint sites. So an example here, a screenshot of what a content source will look like. You pick and choose where the information is coming from. And here we have several sources that are websites, HTTP sites. Should also mention, if you want to search people, you must include the user profile server and it's listed as SPS3 as its protocol. We also have the ability to bring in line of business data, such as information through business data connectivity service. Here an example of the AdventureWorks database. So big things to think about when you're crawling your data. Make sure you do define what your crawler will be crawling as specific as your needs will be. Make sure you don't overuse your resources. Our crawlers are very, very fast. In fact, 2 crawlers potentially can overwhelm our SQL server. The index can be large where we're going to store it. We're going to be impacting those SQL servers on the back end. And in fact, we'll be hitting them a second time if the content is also stored on the same database server or whatever server that content is stored. So be a good neighbor, and we can actually set up and be more efficient through impact rules. We can reduce that overall impact. A lot of companies will schedule crawl during those after hours so that impact is as minimal as we can. We also have the ability to set up specific accounts as that information is crawled specifically, and you get to pick and choose, again, what you're going to crawl. So when you look at search, one of the big things to think about is that it's all about the crawl log. And through the crawl log, we can identify any problems, any warnings or errors, so we can make sure that index is refined the way that we want. If it's not in the index, it's not in search. We do have several reports that you can run. In class, we dive into more detail on these. These are real nice. We can look at the crawl rate, how often the information is being updated, how refined it is. We also have the ability to look at reports based on the health of those queries. Now, when you look at search, the index, the side we've looked at so far, the other part of this is the user interface. And this is referred to as our search center. The search center, we have a out-of-box search center called OSS Search Results. OSS Search Results is the default, but you can go in and build and create your own. Here's a screenshot of the default. Here is the Enterprise Search Center. You also have access to the Basic Search Center if you're using SharePoint Standard. You're going to notice on the left-hand side we have a refinement panel. These are the out-of-box settings, but there are a dozen more refinements that you can add. But here we have the result type, what type of data it is, PDF, web page, the author, and then the date. But other things you can add are size, relevancy, certain columns or companies, partners that you might work with. These are all items. Any column we can create or build refinement for. The display in the middle is what we call our core results. So we can see the results. And then over on the right-hand side, if you hover over one of these items, we have the ability to bring up display templates. The Search Center is broken up into three parts. There's a basic search page that we start off with. That's that search box. We have search results. There's another page we can modify. We also have advanced search page. And we even have different search verticals such as people search, conversation, and video search in those search centers. Now the language that we use, and this is very important in class, we spent a lot of time here, is something called the keyword query language. And as you type in a search query, you can either add by hitting a plus symbol or subtract items from your search results. And just a little tidbit, this does work in the big search company, starts with a G, it works with Bing, it works with our SharePoint search as an easy way to go in and refine search. So you can do weather plus sunshine to add information about sunshine and minus rain, or today in our local area we've got lots of snow, so we could say minus snow. But again, we can add and remove that information simply with this keyword query language. Now, we are just hitting the tip of the iceberg. It's a very rich and robust environment, which you can use to really dive in and with your environment specifically get those exact search results that you want. So when you start looking at search, some of the things to think about is best practices. Look at your SharePoint sites. What do you want to crawl? Look at your crawl depth. Remember, it's all about the index. Use consistent languages, use metadata, use columns. Even though SharePoint Search will look inside of those documents, metadata is what's key. We also have the ability to add pages that you want to be more authoritative that appear at the high end of those search results. Now, for those developers out there, we want to add a few things for you. I want to warn you, though, for my admins. Yep, we're now entering into what I call the SharePoint developer zone. It's a scary place. But this is where we can definitely go in and refine SharePoint even more. The search schema, that is the manage and crawl properties. This allows me to refine exactly what those search results will be. You as the search admin can do this, the site collection administrator, or in online versions, you can do this through your tenants. If you've used SharePoint in the past, what we called a scope or federated location is now result source. What we used to only have was incremental and full crawls. Now we have continuous crawls. Those search results, very important. Fresh index, so continuous crawl is huge. The reports have been renamed. They're query and crawl health reports. We manage now the crawl log instead of working with our host distribution rules or search index. And then we can still do best bets and visual best bets. We now call these query rules with promoted results. Query rules are key in SharePoint search. It allows you to set up a condition. If this keyword is found, then perform this action. I had one company, they kept doing queries on cafeteria, and we found that through our query reports. Well, they had nothing to do with restaurant business. People wanted to know what the lunch menu was. So if we saw a keyword query for cafeteria, we would then display the URL for the lunch menu. You can even turn on and off these query rules for specific date and time. Let's say you have a onboarding process or insurance benefits period, you want to elevate those query results, you could do so. We mentioned the KQL, the keyword query language. It does logical operators such as anding, oring, or not, and we can use those within our result types. We get to pick and choose as a result comes in what type of template is displayed. It's called a rendering or display template. This can be set up and configured as you need. But I do want to show you there are even more things that we can do with search, things you may not be aware of. First of all, it is configured with PowerShell, so make sure you've taken your PowerShell class or bone up on PowerShell before you start using search. Things we can do is a query suggestion. So as a user is typing in information, we can give them suggestions. This does require a text file that you import via PowerShell. A Thesaurus, as you're typing things in this case, emergency assistance, this is really, though, related in our case as first aid. So when they type in emergency assistance, we want to give them first aid links. We can do so with a simple thesaurus. This does require a CSV file. You also import this with PowerShell. Other thing we can do are query spelling corrections. So do you mean this? This also is something we set up through Manage Meta Web Services. And this is set up as a query spelling inclusion. We can also do company names, do special specific company entity extraction. This also uses Manage a Web Service. I should also mention you need your state service here as well. We mentioned the refinement panel. Here's an example of partner organizations that were added in. And based on refinement, we were able to select a partner, and then only those results were displayed. The managing templates, they call these display templates. These are created based on HTML, no longer the old XSLT, and you can build and create whatever elaborate display templates you need. Search can also be used for navigation. So if you want to go out and look for navigational links, these are my departments, for example, we can leverage that. And it's actually a setting in navigation if you're using those publishing features. And then finally, one of the tools that I use for troubleshooting is the search query tool. Now we need to introduce, I do have a couple websites out here, randallhall.blogspot.com and thecloudengineer.blogspot.com, where I put all kinds of information about search. And the search query tool is one of my favorites. It allows us to do a query, look at the raw results, and see if there's any trouble. One of the most common issues people run into is our search results do remove duplicates by default. However, in this case, we can see there were multiple dupes, and we could remove that. So with that, looks like we're about where we need to be time-wise. At this point, we're going to send it over to Kelly. She's going to see if we have any questions out there for me. But I do want to thank you for your time. If you do have any needs for SharePoint search, we have lots of classes out there. There's even a dedicated class on search. Or you can visit my website, randallhall.blogspot.com or thecloudengineer.blogspot.com to get lots of free info. And as far as the SharePoint community, I am active in the Ohio area, Ohio region, with the Buckeye Spug, Cincinnati SharePoint user group, and then encourage you, look for any SharePoint Saturday events are out. These are worldwide events that are vendor sponsored, they're free. You give up a little of your time and a great opportunity to learn about SharePoint.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Randall. That was a great presentation. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to type those in now, and we'll go ahead and ask Randall and address those over audio. I wanted to remind everyone, if you are looking for more information on our Microsoft courses or anything we have to offer, please visit our website at newhorizons.com. As a reminder, that's also where you'll find an updated schedule of our upcoming webinars. These are all free for you to attend, so please take advantage of them and register for any upcoming sessions. You can also find our webinar archive library on our website as well, and that has over 50 of our past webinar recordings for you to access at any time. As a reminder for today, I will be sending you all the PowerPoint presentation as well as a recording link for you to review the session for anything you may have missed or to pass on to any colleagues who were unable to join us. All right, Randall, it looks like we have one question here.
Sure.
Real quick. When planning and configuring, how does this work with a hosted SharePoint system?
So hosted, we're assuming they mean through like Office 365. In that case, Microsoft handles the indexing side for you, but you do have access to the search schema. You still need to modify your managed and crawl properties, but you also have the ability to create your display through the search center. And so some of the items we mentioned as far as topology, you don't have to worry about. Microsoft does all that for you. But you still have to worry about the search schema and the display through your search center.
All right, great. And this next question, in a small company, is it good to have search roles with application server?
Yes, I would always recommend at least the 3-tier model. So you're going to put query on the web front end. The middle tier, you're going to run the other search roles. Then, of course, we have the database server on the back end. But yeah, I still highly recommend at a minimum that 3-layer model.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And it looks like that's going to wrap up our questions for today.
All right, very good.
Thank you again, Randall. Really appreciate you joining us.
Not a problem.
And
have a great one. We'll talk to you later.
All right, and thanks so much, everyone. I hope everyone has a great day. That'll conclude today's session. You may now log off.